give you our wonderful tutorial, I hope, on our block of the month for November, which is the Gateway Arch. And there's a companion block or a bonus block that comes with the Gateway Arch, and that is the Show Me the Books block. And they are constructed very similarly, almost identically, same kind of technique. So I'm going to just kind of do them both. Here's the first block that I made, and I'll just be a little self-critical. It has a little bump right there and it doesn't bother me too much, so don't beat yourself up about small things. And there's the second one I made, and not so much of a bump, so I got a little bit better with practice. That's good. So that you'll enjoy this. It's a different technique of applique than what we've had already, and it was something I learned many years ago when I was thinking about applique, and I'm thinking, you know, that one technique would probably work here. So we'll start with the block. As you're cutting out your pieces to make your cityscape, if you start out with a 2.5 inch background piece and a 2-inch background piece, you should be able to cut all of these out of these two. So of course, start with a little one and cut all the little pieces you can from it. And then you're going to have a couple of books that are a couple of buildings, excuse me, that are a little wider than 2, and then you'll have to crack into your wider strip. But if you just cut a 2.5 inch strip and a 2-inch strip, you should be able to cut all your background to your buildings out of those 2 strips. So you're not handling all this fabric. It's much easier to handle a smaller piece of fabric. So 2 strips, and you can maneuver it on your board and get the sizes you need for the background. When you cut out your pieces, it's really important that you keep them labeled. I think on the handout I also labeled these, but if you kind of keep them in order, you probably don't need to over-label with those. But make sure they're labeled and keep the label on your block until they're all sewn together. So you would go over to your sewing machine and you'll just grab these 2 together, chain piece it. I mentioned that in the handout too. Chain piecing is a very efficient way of piecing a lot of similar things together kind of right after another, the factory method. So you'll just sew this to this and this, you'll just sew them all together kind of one after the other without breaking your thread. And then when you're all done, you'll have a nice little pendant, or what was that called? You'll have a little thing with all your pieces on it, and then you can snip it apart and just make sure you have your letters still on hooked to the top piece, so you can, if you drop them, then you don't have to figure it all out again. So once you sew all your buildings to the background, and then line them up, and then you're sewing all the buildings together to make the cityscape. I would suggest that you sew these together from the top down, sew these together from the top down, sew these together from the top down. Do every pair from the top down, and then when you start joining the pairs, sew them together from the bottom up. Because it's really important when you're sewing multiple things that have a lot of seams opposite each time. So you're sewing from top to bottom on this seam and bottom to top on this seam. And as long as you do that on similarly things like this, then you can prevent this bowing effect. If I had sewn all of these from the same direction because it was easier, then you will have a bowing effect, because your sewing machine it's how the sewing machine tension works, and your top and your bottom are just off a little. So if you sew this one this way, then this one this way, they kind of even it up, if that makes any sense. So just make sure you just alternate your seams, and I actually managed pretty well to keep it pretty vertical, and I didn't have too many troubles because I did do that, and I've learned that the hard way, by the way. So just make sure you just seaming opposite when you're doing this kind of thing. And once you get this all done, then I would just trim a little bit off of the bottom section just to kind of even it up, and then cut this section to 9.5 height. Okay, you're going to have about a 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch extra at the top, and I made it that way on purpose so you'd have a little wiggle room. So trim up, give a little haircut along the bottom, cut this to 9.5 inches, and then cut it to 12.5 inches wide. And if you notice, I have kind of a wide book on the end, and that's very intentional, because then you can, if you need to chop off a 1/2 inch, do it from here versus here. because that's a wider piece that you won't miss that 1/2 inch. And I believe this is intentionally a little slightly wider as well. So trim this whole piece to 9.5 by 12.5. Okay, and that's your top part. And then this part, this is your greenery, your stairs and greenery. And I've used various things for my stairs. I used a little funny hexagon fabric. I used some pencils that kind of look like stairs, but I didn't have enough to make them straight, so I just said, I'm just going with it. So it doesn't have to be perfect, and it can be just something interesting. It just represents the stairs that come down from the archway. So then you sew these 3 together, and sew the Mississippi River to that, and this should be 12.5 inches wide. And then once that piece is done, then you just sew it to the top piece. You don't need to do any trimming. This should be pretty close, and it's not that much sewing, not too many small pieces. So do this piece, then sew it to this nicely trimmed piece, and there is your block, part 1, okay? And let me just switch kind of to the bookshelf block a little bit. So on the bookshelf block, in the handout, I probably gave you way too much information on the bookshelf block, but it's one of my favorite blocks for a fun quilt. And the way I did mine, I was kind of shooting for putting everything in my block that I couldn't fit in my regular Missouri, I love Missouri Bicentennial quilt. So I have the blues, I like to bowl. I decided to put the sports in, and I put in bowling because that really is important, bowling. And I have the Chiefs, and I didn't put in the Rams, you know. And so my kids played soccer, so I threw in some soccer, the cards, my neighborhood, I can't remember what that block was, the library, Paul's Donuts, which is no longer with us, and my favorite Mexican restaurant right there. So I put all the things that I love about Missouri that I couldn't fit in my regular quilt. But I used, if you haven't noticed, I used the same size of books as I used for buildings. The only difference I made is that I made, instead of having the building this size, I made it this size. So this will become your book. And this will become the book. Take all these off. So if you use the same measurements as we used to make the arch block, and you want to make the bookshelf block, all you are doing is making your buildings a little longer to be books. Okay? That's the only difference. And I gave you those measurements. And that's merely one way to do this block. So, there you go. There's one way. Here's Cindy's block. It looks very cute. And in the bookshelf block, sometimes a darker print up here does give it more depth and gives you the illusion of books being on a shelf. So there is that to consider. I went with white because I was trying to use my background for my quilt. So, but that's a good thing to bring up, is that sometimes darker fabric in the background gives it a nice depth. Once you get your block all nice and put together, pretend my arch is not on here, then we have to construct the arch. And the way I'm asking you to try, and if you have another method that you would prefer, then feel free to do that as well, because there's lots of ways to applique, and this was just one more I thought we'd throw in your arsenal that you'd have for another time. So all I did, it's kind of the cardboard template method. You have the template. You will be gluing that paper onto like a cereal box weight cardboard. I think you need at least that. And so you glue the leg part on, and then you glue the top on. And just trim out the little top piece. And when you look at your instructions, you'll see what I mean. You trim out the little top piece, keep that separate, glue the paper on at the legs onto your cardboard, and then add your top piece. And what that does, I was going to have you do it a different way, but what this does, if you do it the way I suggested, it keeps your arch the right distance apart on the legs. Otherwise, you're going to be fighting it the whole time. But if you actually look at your handout and just trim out this little top piece first and leave everything else intact, don't trim anything else, then take what's left of the paper, glue it onto your cardboard, just put glue behind the legs, put it on, and then glue this little top of your arch on, and then trim it out. Then your arch stays the right shape. If you don't do it that way, you're fighting it and trying to figure out how far away apart were those legs, and your arch will look wonky. So this is the only way I could think of to keep you the right proportion. Okay, so on the cardboard template, so what I did is I put a little bit of glue on the back side of my cardboard, put a little glue, and I laid it on the back side of my fabric because I wanted to kind of hold it in place. Not a lot of glue, don't be over gluing or anything, just enough to kind of hold it into place. And then I just did my rough trim around. I just kind of cut it out. You can see it wasn't any consistency, just sort of, you know, right around there. And then I gave myself a few little slits right here because we need a little room. I just made some little cuts so that the fabric could bend around that inner curve. I didn't need to do it on the outside because there was plenty. It was just this little curve right here. I had to kind of do some slits to give it a little bit so I could iron it through. I used starch, and I kind of just starched it all. I kind of partially ironed this about when I was at home. And I just kind of, you just kind of press the fabric around the cardboard template. Just watch your fingers, of course. And the starch holds it into position. Starch is important because once you pull out the cardboard, the starch kind of keeps it in its shape and kind of keeps your creases pretty nice. So this is all I did. And I'll go through the middle here. So the middle is probably going to be your hardest spot, but if you cut those little slits in it, you're good because the fabric will just kind of, don't cut past the line or anything. You don't want your slit to show on the other side, of course, but cut it almost to that line. Okay, I'll just finish up here. And then you're gonna have to kind of make that work a little bit there. And when you go to actually applique, you may have to tuck in some of these little tails right there. And I am not great at applique. I have very kindergarten level applique skills, I guess I'd say. But then when you turn it around with this method, it looks pretty sharp.
If you want, one of the other things besides just this is to do a hand stitch running stitch, and when you pull it, it'll curve it.
There you go.
So that's another option. You're still going to want the cardboard. You're still going to want to make sure that it fits.
That's good. We'll just kind of put it like a little gather that you tighten up around there.
Like
there you go.
Yo-yo, it'll gather it.
Yeah, and she's much better at applique than I. So, and then if you've done a pretty good job, you know, along here, and I obviously need some more starch here. That's why I kind of wanted to show you this because it's kind of tricky. Not tricky. It's just kind of labor.
A little more labor intensive.
Labor intensive. You could use like a cardboard circle to make little round things for applique. I'm trying to think what I actually learned on was a heart. It was a cardboard heart, and we did this method. As you can see, it actually gives you, if you do go all the way around, gives you a nice good crease. It actually looks pretty good. And go flowery. Think big. Your arch doesn't have to be boring. So anyway, there you go. So then the next thing I did before I took out the template, because once you take it out, it becomes all this waft. It becomes very wiggly. So I actually looked at my block and said, okay, I want them to be about the same distance in the greenery from the steps. So like I kind of knew where I wanted to put my legs. Oops. Yeah, there. So I actually put a pin where I wanted my legs to be, and you actually probably could put a pin up here if you wanted to know where your top was. Just to kind of get an idea. Ignore the fact that there's already an arch there. And then when you go ahead and take this off, it should pretty much, the glue doesn't hardly stay on because I didn't use a lot. And you got a pretty good shape. And you just will pin it there. You'll pin it there. Just get it into place. Oops. Get your arch. You may have to go along it and pin it down, and then kind of tuck all your crease under. Or use more starch. There you go. So then I would probably pin all this. Does that make sense? And then I actually would pin the inner, and I'd probably pin the outer. I'd probably do 2 sets of pins. And then you're ready to sew it on. I did it twice, and both times I intuitively sewed on the outside first. I actually went across, I did around, over, and then I did the interior. And I just found it was easier. I think I would have fought it more if I had done the interior first and then the outer. So that's just what worked for me. So definitely mark where you want your arch to be before you take out the cardboard, and then pin generously. Pin it into place, and then you can adjust it if you need to. And by folding it back over the cardboard, putting a little starch on it, and pressing it very well, you should have a very nice line to follow. And then you can either machine applique that on. I hand appliqued mine on. I didn't do too bad a job, so it's not my best thing, but there you go. That's how you apply the arch. Now, if you want your arch to go down a little farther to the water, that's your arch. You do what you want to it. So you place your arch where you want. I put it kind of in the greenery because that's kind of where it sits in real life as you're looking at the arch.
As long as it's not flooding.
If it's not flooding and going up these steps, right, we're in good shape. So this is the arch as you would see it from the Illinois side. Sometimes when I make bookshelf blocks, because I kind of enjoy those, I like to try and change it up a little bit. So here is a way, and I have it in your handout. And if you want to make a book that leans, here is a way you can do it. So there's my block. So this is the book that I want to lean, like this. So what you have to do, you have to kind of over sew on the background fabric, because you need enough to make it go lean like that. And it's important, I guess, in the directions I gave you, it's very wordy and a lot of details there, but there's one easy thing. You're going to be cutting this block 1/4 inch from this tip and 1/4 inch from this tip. So, and I found that my square ruler was a kind of snazzy way to do that. So, I'm putting my ruler 1/4 inch away from that top right there. And I'm putting 1/4 inch from here. And if you look at my book, this is what it's going to look like. That's how it's going to look like on the shelf. Is that cool? So, overbuild the background around your book, and then however you do it, you cut 1/4 inch from there, 1/4 inch from there. All right. So, and I don't want it to lean very far. I just want a slight lean because I have too much stuff in my block. Okay. So 1/4 inch from there and 1/4 inch from there. And you can gauge the lean of your block by just moving your ruler. Does that make sense? So I want a kind of a slight lean, not too much of a lean. But the important thing is to remember is that whatever lean you have, you leave 1/4 inch here, you leave 1/4 inch there. All right, then we'll do the deed. Because I have a little bit here. And I had to think this out this morning. I thought, that wasn't too bad when I did it before. Okay. So there you go. And then I'm going to do it the other way so I get my square. Let's see, 1/4 inch from there. Okay, because that's where your seam is going to be. If you want your bookshelf to sit on your shelf just right. Okay, and now you have two sides of your rectangle, and now you can go ahead and just cut it like a rectangle. So, however wide you need your book, I'm going to just assume that. No, actually, I want my book kind of skinny. So I don't have a lot of room because, oh, I've got to throw this in right now. Because right next to my blues block, I'm going to put the Stanley Cup. I got my Stanley Cup done. So, okay, let me get my right, okay. All right, so I'm going to cut my block probably about there. And I'm just kind of lining it up, and I've already got two sides of my rectangle because I'm going to have this right next to it. So I have a slight lean to my block. Does that look all right? So now I'm going to make sure I got my quarter inch right there, and I'm straight here, and I'm just finishing lining up my rectangle. I hope that makes sense because I tried to explain it on the directions, but yeah, you know, sometimes it's harder to explain. And I need my 12.5 inches high. And you do have extra, so it's kind of built in that you're going to be trimming a little from the top. Okay. So there's my leaner. And it's going to go next to, appropriately, the mini Stanley Cup. And then I decided to do just all the sports teams. And honestly, this is probably a little wide. Let's see, there. And once you sew that in there, right there, that book will touch there. And it looks like a leaner. It's probably a little wide, so I probably would trim a little off my cardinals. I might trim a little off the baseballs before I assemble, because I really want this to be 12.5 inches wide. So sometimes when you're more spontaneous and kind of doing your own thing on your books, you gotta have some wiggle room, and I might take out the soccer piece. I'm not sure. So whatever I will do, this will end up to be 12.5 inches, and it will be in my quilt. Mini Stanley Cup, Little Blues book right there, and then the other sports teams right there. You do not have to follow this pattern if you decide to do the bookshelf. You do not have to follow the measurements that we used for the arch. That is totally up to you. And this, I used a more random approach where I just kind of said, oh, that looks good that wide, and boom, and I cut it and made that match. And it's always good, though, to have a fat book on the end, because then that's where you can do any trimming. Like I can cut probably a little bit out of there and get that cardinal in there and still get credit for it being a cardinal block. But so always make your end book on either end fat. Then you can trim it to match, to work. So bookshelf blocks are a lot of fun, and they just seem to work well with our arch block. One lady has already beat us to the punch on making a bookshelf block, and I believe she did a Mark Twain silhouette, and she did some fancy embroidery on her machine and did a Tom Sawyer name on her book. So there's certainly a lot of Missouri authors you could do. You could do, and I was going to throw a Disney book in here, but I ran out of space. So you could do a lot of books that represent other parts of Missouri that you don't have time to fit into your quilt. Like there's Disney, Mark Twain, Little House on the Prairie. There's just lots of things. You could do a Civil War reference. There's just a lot of things. There are other things that mean something to you, like Paul's Donuts. Oh, I miss them. Thanks. And if you have any questions, please contact Cindy or myself. You have our emails. And also, you can always ask questions on our Facebook page. And we're glad to help. And I hope you have fun with your arch and with your bookshelf if you decide to do that. And I tried to give you some other fun bookshelf ideas because it is kind of on my list of a quilt that I like to do. My own giant bookshelf quilt. So it's kind of an obsession I have. So I enjoyed these two blocks because it was kind of fun to put them together. So anyway, enjoy, keep sewing, and we'll see you next time.